It started like any other Saturday morning. I was humming a little tune in the kitchen, arranging fresh flowers on the counter, when my phone buzzed. A message from my husband, simple and casual. "Mom said she left the keys for you in the drawer." I froze. "What keys?" I grabbed my purse and ran to the drawer in our bedroom. There, sitting innocently in the wooden compartment, was a small keychain with the unmistakable keys to our house. My hands trembled as a sinking feeling crept through my chest. Our house, our sanctuary, and then it hit me like a thunderclap. A second message popped up. "Oh, and she gave some to your sister-in-law too." My vision blurred. I dropped the keys back onto the drawer as if the act could somehow erase the sting. I sank onto the edge of our bed, gripping the sheets as anger, confusion, and hurt collided in a storm inside me. My mother-in-law had given our home keys to her daughter, my sister-in-law, without even asking me, without even considering that my husband and I might feel differently. It felt like a betrayal layered over years of small manipulations, a quiet assertion of control disguised as generosity. My sanctuary, my home, had been handed to someone else like it was a casual favor. I could almost hear the unspoken message: "This isn't truly yours. You are only a guest in the family's real world." I thought of my husband. He was at work, completely oblivious, probably thinking everything was normal. Should I call him immediately, confront him? My fingers hovered over the phone, but deep down, I knew this wasn't his doing. He loved me, or at least I had always believed that, but his mother had a way of weaving herself into his decisions so subtly that he often didn't see her influence until it was too late. I paced the room, each step fueled by a mix of rage and disbelief. Every detail of my life with this family suddenly felt fragile. Was it just me, or had the line between love and manipulation always been this blurry? I remembered all the little comments my mother-in-law had made over the years, the subtle undermining, the way she praised my sister-in-law while ignoring my efforts. And now this, a physical manifestation of her favoritism, right in our home. Anger alone wasn't enough to soothe the hurt. I felt violated, exposed, like someone had reached into my life and rearranged its pieces without permission. The thought of my sister-in-law entering our home freely with keys in her hand filled me with a cold dread. She had never respected boundaries, and now she had been granted official access to the space that had been built with love, effort, and countless memories. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe through the whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal wasn't just an abstract concept anymore. It was tangible, metallic, heavy in my chest. But beneath the sting, a spark of resolve began to ignite. I refused to let this act define me or my home. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law would not walk into my life thinking they had the power to unsettle me. I wouldn't respond with screaming or tears. I would respond with strategy, with calm, with a power they couldn't predict. I could imagine the next conversation. My husband coming home, noticing the tension in my posture, the subtle edge in my voice. How would I tell him? Should I accuse his mother outright, or should I let him piece it together on his own? There was satisfaction in knowing that I had time to plan, to measure every word, every glance, every reaction. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, and my own heartbeat, loud in my ears. I traced the keys again with my fingertips, the cold metal biting into my skin, and made a decision. I would not allow this betrayal to crush me, but I would let it teach a lesson wrapped in patience, poise, and a little sweet revenge. As I sat on the edge of the bed, the early morning sunlight spilling across the floor, I felt the first flicker of determination. My mother-in-law had underestimated me. She thought she could assert her control, but she didn't realize that sometimes the quietest reactions are the most powerful. She had handed the keys to our house to someone who would never respect the boundaries of another. But her daughter-in-law, the one she thought she could sideline, was about to show her exactly what happens when you awaken the storm behind the calm. And that storm was just beginning to gather. The day passed like a slow, moving storm. Every time my husband called to check in, I forced myself to sound cheerful, masking the turmoil swirling beneath the surface. I couldn't let him see my anger, not yet. If there was one thing I had learned from years of watching my mother-in-law manipulate, it was that a reaction could be turned against you in a heartbeat. Patience, I reminded myself, was my ally now. I spent hours quietly observing, noticing every pattern, every subtle move. How my sister-in-law always expected favors. How my mother-in-law spoke as though she owned the home. How my husband, kind and well-meaning, sometimes failed to notice the undercurrents. Knowledge, I realized, was power, and I intended to wield it carefully. That evening, when my mother-in-law called to ask if everything was okay with the keys, I smiled politely over the phone. I didn't accuse, I didn't demand explanations. Instead, I said something that caught her off guard. Yes, everything's fine. Thank you for thinking of us. I'll make sure to keep them safe. The calmness in my voice, so measured and unwavering, was like a subtle warning. She paused for a fraction of a second, then laughed lightly, as though brushing off the tension. But I knew she had noticed something. Even the smallest acknowledgement of awareness could plant doubt in a manipulator's mind. And that doubt, tiny seed, would grow. I started small, almost imperceptible adjustments in the house. I placed locks on certain drawers, arranged items in a way that only I could navigate comfortably, and made sure my husband noticed these changes casually. I thought it might be safer if the keys weren't just lying around. I said one evening over dinner, brushing it off as simple housekeeping. It was subtle, but the message was clear. I knew. I was aware of the intrusion, and I was taking quiet, deliberate steps to assert control over my space. I saw the way my husband looked at me, a flicker of realization in his eyes, and I smiled softly inside. He didn't need all the details, just the understanding that I was capable, that I wasn't going to be steamrolled. My mind worked constantly, planning, anticipating. What would happen if my sister-in-law visited unexpectedly? How would my mother-in-law react if she tried to assert dominance in my own home? Every scenario played out in my head, each one ending with me calm, composed, and subtly victorious. I would not need to raise my voice. My actions, my poise, my carefully crafted gestures would speak louder than anger ever could. Evenings became my strategy sessions. I sat with a cup of tea, the soft hum of the ceiling fan above, thinking through every potential encounter. I mapped the exact spots where she might linger, where she might overstep, and planned my gentle corrections. Every word I would speak, every smile I would offer, had purpose. I realized something profound. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, controlled, and almost invisible until the moment it's too late for the other person to react. And while I was strategizing, I allowed myself small indulgences of satisfaction, a glance of surprise when I casually moved something she might have taken for granted, a subtle comment about the importance of respecting each other's spaces. I could feel the subtle shifts in the household dynamic, though outwardly everything appeared normal. The calmness I displayed was a silent rebellion, and the first taste of sweet control was intoxicating. By the end of the week, my husband finally approached me privately, his voice low, hesitant. "I didn't realize she gave the keys to your sister," he said. I looked at him, keeping my expression neutral, letting him feel the weight of the oversight. I noticed. I replied simply, "But don't worry, I've handled it." That simple phrase, so understated, carried more power than an argument ever could. He nodded slowly, a flicker of pride and admiration crossing his face. In that moment, I realized the first victory had been won. Not through confrontation, not through anger, but through control, composure, and the quiet assertion of boundaries. I leaned back, letting a small smile tug at my lips. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law had made the first move, expecting chaos, expecting tears, expecting weakness. But instead, I had given them calm, and sometimes calm was more dangerous than fire. The storm of betrayal still lingered, yes, but now it was tempered by strategy. And I was ready. When the time came, my answer to both my husband and my in-laws would change everything. For now I waited, patient and poised, knowing that the sweetest revenge is never rushed, and the most satisfying victories are always planned. The weekend arrived, and with it, the perfect opportunity. My mother-in-law called, her voice tinged with excitement. "We were thinking of dropping by tomorrow. Is that okay?" I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough for her to feel the tiniest flicker of uncertainty. Then I replied, calm and sweet, "Of course, we'd love to see you. Why don't you come for lunch?" That evening, I prepared the house meticulously. Every room was tidy, every surface gleaming. I even arranged a small tray of refreshments near the living room, careful to place it exactly where I knew my sister-in-law would reach first. It wasn't about arrogance or show, it was about control, about creating the perfect stage. When they arrived, I greeted them with warmth and grace, my husband quietly following behind. I could see the subtle surprise in my mother-in-law's eyes at my composure. She had expected tension, maybe even tears, but instead I smiled, led them into the living room, and offered them drinks. The first part of my plan was simple. Let them feel comfortable, even welcome, while subtly exposing their overreach. My sister-in-law reached for the couch near the window, assuming it was hers, because she had keys and, therefore, entitlement. I gestured with a serene smile. "Oh, that's actually my favorite spot. Would you mind if I sit there?" Her hand hovered awkwardly and my mother-in-law stiffened. That small moment, almost invisible, was the first ripple. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't accusing. I was simply asserting what was already mine. And the discomfort was deliciously subtle. Over lunch, I kept the conversation light but pointed. It's amazing how much comfort a home gives when boundaries are respected. I said casually, as I served the food. It makes living together so much easier when everyone knows what belongs to whom. They laughed politely, but I could see the flicker of awareness in my mother-in-law's eyes. My sister-in-law, however, tried to counter with jokes and chatter, clearly attempting to reclaim a sense of entitlement. I let her speak, nodded, smiled, and then offered small corrections or adjustments, not with anger, but with a calm precision that made it clear who truly controlled the space. After lunch, I suggested a little tour of the house, a way to show them the changes I had made. Each step was calculated. The locks on drawers they had no reason to touch, the rearranged furniture subtly signaling ownership, the little labels on certain items as reminders of boundaries. My mother-in-law noticed, her polite smile faltering ever so slightly. My sister-in-law tried to brush past it, but her glance at me betrayed her irritation. Finally, the moment I had been waiting for arrived. I invited them into the living room, where a photo album sat on the coffee table, a collection of memories from the life my husband and I had built together. I opened it casually and pointed to a picture of our first home renovation. "I remember how much effort we put into this space," I said softly, almost to myself. It's incredible how a house becomes a home when it's respected and cared for. I could see the recognition dawning on my mother-in-law. The casual phrasing, the pride, the hint of reproach. It was subtle, but it landed. She realized that her attempt to insert her daughter into our home hadn't gone unnoticed. She realized that I was aware, and more than aware, I was quietly reclaiming control. Even my husband, who had been watching silently, now looked at me with new admiration. His hand found mine under the table, squeezing lightly, a silent acknowledgement that I had handled everything perfectly. He had never seen me so composed, so strategically assertive, and he was beginning to understand that my strength wasn't loud, it was unshakable. By the time they left, the atmosphere had shifted completely. My mother-in-law's polite smile no longer carried confidence, and my sister-in-law's usual arrogance had been replaced with a subtle caution. They had been reminded without a single raised voice, without confrontation, that boundaries were not negotiable and that I, not them, held authority in my own home. As I closed the door behind them, I exhaled, feeling a mix of relief and quiet triumph. The revenge had been sweet, not because it humiliated anyone, but because it asserted my dignity, my intelligence, and my right to control my own life. I had turned betrayal into empowerment, and in doing so, I had made it clear the storm I had promised in my mind during Chapter 1 was no longer a threat. It was a reality, gentle yet unstoppable. And as I stood there, looking around the home I had defended with poise and strategy, I knew that the balance had shifted. Respect had been earned, not demanded, and sometimes that is the sweetest victory of all. The days after their visit felt lighter, almost serene. The tension that had hung over the house like a thick fog had lifted, replaced by a quiet sense of control and equilibrium. I moved through my home with the same calm confidence I had displayed during their visit, knowing that every step, every glance, and every small action reinforced the message I had sent. My husband, once passive in the subtle dynamics of his family, now seemed different. He lingered near me more often, asked for my input on decisions, and even gently reminded his mother about respecting our boundaries. I caught him watching me one evening, a quiet admiration in his eyes. "You handled everything beautifully," he said, his voice low, almost reverent. There was no condescension in it, no guilt, just acknowledgement. Even my mother-in-law's phone calls changed. She no longer spoke with the assumed authority of entitlement. Instead, there was a politeness, a carefulness, almost a hint of respect that had never been there before. She didn't apologize outright, but her tone was different, warmer, yet tempered, as though she had recognized that I was not someone to underestimate. And my sister-in-law, oh, she was the most fascinating to watch. Gone was her usual brash confidence. When she visited again, she lingered near the edge of conversations, her usual jokes lighter, her hand movements careful. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I noticed. She had learned in her own way that the space I protected was not hers to invade. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting golden light across our living room, I reflected on everything that had happened. Betrayal had been the spark, yes, but it had been my calm, deliberate response that had reshaped the relationships around me. I realized with a quiet pride that revenge was never about causing pain. It was about reclaiming dignity, asserting boundaries, and demonstrating strength. And I had done it with grace. My husband joined me on the couch, his hand brushing mine. I never realized how much I relied on them controlling things. He admitted softly, "You showed me and them that our home is ours." I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with justice and partnership. "Sometimes people forget that respect is earned, not given," I said, "and sometimes you have to show it without shouting. The calmest actions carry the most weight." That night, after the house had settled into its usual quiet rhythm, I took a walk through each room, touching the surfaces, remembering the memories embedded in every corner. This house had been built with love, compromise, and effort. My husband and I had poured ourselves into it. Now, more than ever, it felt like ours. I thought about the lessons learned. My mother-in-law had learned that her manipulations could be seen and addressed. My sister-in-law had learned that entitlement had limits. And my husband had learned to trust my judgment and strength. And I, above all, had learned that power did not have to be loud or vengeful to be absolute. The next time they visited, the atmosphere was markedly different. There were smiles, polite conversations, even laughter, but the unspoken boundaries were clear. No one reached for spaces or privileges that weren't theirs. No one overstepped in thoughtless ways. My calm, measured strategy had not only protected my home, but had transformed the relationships themselves. Respect had replaced tension, and acknowledgement had replaced entitlement. As I stood by the window that evening, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade, I realized that closure was not about confrontation or punishment. It was about asserting one's presence, maintaining dignity, and allowing those who challenged you to recognize your strength. I felt no bitterness, only a serene satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing you have defended your life and home with intelligence, grace, and integrity. The house, once a stage for betrayal, had become a fortress of respect. And in that quiet victory, I found something far sweeter than revenge: empowerment, balance, and peace. For the first time since the betrayal, I slept without tension, without worry, confident that my home was mine. Not because I had forced it to be, but because I had shown, quietly and unwaveringly, that I was the one who truly deserved to protect it. And that, I knew, was the ultimate triumph.